Thank you very much. Let me first begin by thanking the organizers for giving me this chance to talk to what is a very important and politically active audience and interest group in the United States. Secondly, I'm not going to present the U.S. or American perspective. What I'd like to present is an American perspective. And to do that, I'd like to put the issue of Ukrainian membership in NATO in a somewhat broader context. Now, the Orange Revolution inspired many hopes, both in the West and in the Ukraine itself, that Ukraine had turned an important corner, and that the election of Yushchenko as president would lead to Ukraine's rapid integration into Euro-Atlantic institutions, particularly NATO. However, this integration, especially into NATO, has proven much harder to carry out than was anticipated. And I would say there are several factors that affected this and a reason for it. The first is that unlike Eastern Europe, where NATO enjoyed a very strong and positive image, in Ukraine, NATO had a negative image due to decades of anti-NATO propaganda and by the communist authorities. I don't have to go into the details of this. But the effect was that NATO had much lower support in Ukraine in comparison to other states in Eastern Europe. Second, within the West, there was no consensus about policy towards Ukraine. While some countries, such as Poland and the United States, favored an active effort to support Ukraine's integration into Euro-Atlantic institutions, particularly NATO, many European countries had doubts about whether Ukraine was really an independent country and continued to view it implicitly, if not explicitly, as part of Russia's sphere of influence. This lack of unity inhibited the development of a coherent Western strategy towards Ukraine. Finally, of course, Russian opposition played an important role. Ukraine's integration into Euro-Atlantic institutions, above all NATO, was seen by Moscow as representing a major strategic setback which would alter the balance of power in Central Europe to Russia's disadvantage and foreclose any residual possibility of possibly building a Slavic Union composed of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. And in the early years after independence, good to remember that Ukraine pursued, essentially in real terms, a non-aligned policy, as the way in which James Shure described it. Kyiv initially opposed NATO enlargement because it feared it would create new dividing lines in Europe and lead to increased Russian pressure on Ukraine. However, that changed in 1995. Kyiv dropped its opposition to NATO enlargement and began to regard the membership of Central European countries, especially Poland, in NATO as having security benefits for Ukraine as well as for NATO itself. Ukraine, as was mentioned, was the first CIS country to join the Partnership for Peace, and it has been one of the most active participants in PFP exercises. And at the NATO summit in Madrid in July 1997, Ukraine signed the charter on a distinctive partnership with NATO. Although the charter did not explicitly give security guarantees, it called for the establishment of a crisis consultative mechanism that could be activated if Ukraine perceived a direct threat to its security. The charter also foresaw a broad expansion of ties between NATO and Ukraine in a number of key areas, such as democratic control of armed forces, civil-military relations, and armaments cooperation. Ukraine also built individual security relationships with Britain and the United States. This rapprochement with NATO was not undertaken, and this is important, because Ukraine felt a major threat, military threat. Rather, I would argue, it was part of a carefully calculated political balancing act pursued by President Kuchma at the time, who sought to strengthen ties to NATO as a means of increasing his political leverage with Moscow. Contrary to the concerns that expressed by many critics at the time, who feared that intensifying ties to NATO would lead to a sharp deterioration of relations with Russia, the rapprochement with NATO increased Ukraine's freedom of maneuver and led to an improvement of ties with Moscow. President Yeltsin's decision to sign the long-delayed Russian-Ukrainian Friendship and Cooperation Treaty in 1997 was in large part motivated by a desire to counter Ukraine's growing rapprochement with NATO. It reflected a recognition by Yeltsin that these delaying tactics that he'd been pursuing were driving Kyiv more strongly into the arms of the West. In May of 2002, Kuchma announced that Ukraine intended to abandon its policy of non-alignment and apply for NATO membership. Here again, the decision was part of a calculated effort to counterbalance Russia. President Putin's decision was to support the United States in the war on terrorism at that time, and the subsequent improvement in U.S.-Russian relations raised the prospect that Russia would have a closer relationship with NATO than Ukraine. Thus, Ukraine's application for NATO membership was designed to undercut this prospect. However, as you know, Kuchma's increasingly repressive internal policies, particularly the Gongadze affair, as well as suspicions mentioned earlier, never proved that Ukraine had sold aircraft tracking systems to Iraq, the so-called Kolchuga affair, led NATO to put relations with Ukraine on hold. Then came Yushchenko's election as president in December 2004, which opened up a completely new stage in Ukraine's relations with NATO. In an attempt to encourage Yushchenko's pro-Western reform course, NATO offered Ukraine intensive dialogue status in April of 2005, which was seen as a preparatory step towards an individualized membership action plan. By the spring of 2006, there was widespread expectation that Ukraine would be offered a membership action plan at the NATO summit in Riga in November of 2006, with a possible invitation for membership in 2008. However, the collapse of the Orange Coalition in the summer of 2006 and Yanukovych's return to power as prime minister dashed these hopes. During his trip to Brussels, as was mentioned, Yanukovych withdrew Ukraine's application for a membership action plan, and the issue more or less became a dead letter until the elections in September of 2007, which resulted in the victory of the Orange Coalition. As Damon Wilson explained earlier, one of the first acts of the new Ukrainian government, headed by Tymoshenko, was to revive Ukraine's application for MAP, which Yanukovych had withdrawn. And that Tymoshenko, Yushchenko, and Rada chairman Arseniy Yatsyuk sent a letter to NATO seeking membership at the Bucharest summit. Now, Ukraine's request for a MAP membership and membership action plan, along with that of Georgia, touched off a lively debate within the alliance in the run-up to the summit in Bucharest in April of 2008. President Bush, as Damon mentioned this morning, pushed hard for the alliance to grant Ukraine and Georgia membership action status, which was viewed by many, especially in Russia, as being a precursor to NATO membership. France and Germany, however, opposed the idea, fearing that it would undercut an improvement of NATO's relations with Russia. The debate over MAP at Bucharest was not just a debate about Ukraine and Georgia's technical performance, whether they met new standards set down in the NATO doctrine. It was really a much broader debate about the future of enlargement and more generally about relations with Russia. Those who opposed granting Georgia and Ukraine Membership Action Plan did so not only because they doubted whether Georgia and Ukraine were really prepared for NATO membership, but also because they feared granting Georgia and Ukraine Membership Action Plan would be for the first step down a slippery slope of a process that they could not control and which threatened to strain NATO's cohesion and relations with Moscow. The Bucharest summit ended up with a confusing compromise. France and Germany succeeded in blocking the granting of MAP to Ukraine and Georgia. However, the communique issued at the summit, as has been mentioned, stated that Ukraine and Georgia would one day be admitted to NATO, although no specific date was given. Thus, from Moscow's point of view, the outcome was even worse than the Russian leadership had expected. Ukraine and Georgia had been denied MAP, but had been given, in fact, formal commitment that they would one day become members of the alliance, much more than they had expected. Now, I think there has been a paradigm change. The Bucharest summit marked the high mark of Ukraine's advance towards NATO membership. Since the summit, prospects for Ukraine's entry into NATO have declined. Several factors have been contributed to this situation. The first, of course, was the Russo-Georgian War in August of 2008. The Russian invasion of Georgia was a sharp reminder that power politics still mattered and underscored that Russia was prepared to defend its interests in the post-Soviet space with force if necessary. The invasion made clear that Russia was still a power to be reckoned with, and that any attempt to establish security in the post-Soviet space would need to take Russian security interests into account. At the same time, and James alluded to this, it underscored the limits of American power. When push came to shove, few NATO members, including the United States, had much stomach for a military confrontation with Russia over Georgia. In short, the invasion had a sobering impact on Western thinking about the modalities and the wisdom of NATO's enlargement into the post-Soviet space. And in the aftermath of the invasion, the issue of NATO membership for Ukraine and Georgia was put on hold. While the door to NATO membership remains open to Ukraine, and I'm sure that that will be reinforced at the NATO summit here in Chicago, in reality, there is little support now in Western capitals for further enlargement of the alliance in the near term beyond going into the post-Soviet space. The Bush administration pursued an active policy towards the Western periphery of the Soviet space. Ukraine was seen as a poster child for the administration's democracy promotion program, as both countries, Ukraine and Georgia, underwent color revolutions. As noted earlier, Bush supported strongly awarding membership action status to Ukraine and Georgia at the Bucharest summit. The Obama administration, by contrast, has been much more cautious and circumspect in its approach to the expansion of Western interests into the Western periphery of the post-Soviet space. While the door to Georgian and Ukrainian membership in NATO has been kept open, rhetorically, in practice, membership for both countries has been put on hold and subordinated to the administration's effort to reset relations with Moscow. In addition, the democratic revolutions in the Middle East have diverted attention away from the CIS, post-Soviet space. With the Middle East in turmoil, Washington has been forced to focus increasing attention on trying to stabilize the Middle East and has had less time and energy to pay attention to developments in the post-Soviet space. This is a reality. It's not much that one can do about it, but that is a factor that affects the American policy. Now, this isn't to argue that the Obama reset policy means that the United States is abandoning support for democracy or reform in Ukraine or the western periphery of the post-Soviet space. U.S. officials have repeatedly stressed that the United States does not accept the idea of spheres of influence. Indeed, completing Europe, that is, extending stability, security, and prosperity and democracy to the entire European continent, is one of the explicit goals of the Obama policy. When Yanukovych came to power, many observers expected that he would in fact pursue a multi-vector policy similar to the one pursued by President Kuchma. This didn't happen. In his first 18 months in office, Yanukovych has pursued a series of policies that have exacerbated internal tensions, diminished the prospects for closer ties to the West, and reduced Ukraine's freedom of maneuver. This has left Ukraine more isolated internationally and created conditions for Kyiv's potential drift into the Russian economic and political orbit. In practical terms, Yanukovych's withdrawal of Ukraine's application for NATO does not mean very much, since there is at this point little support in NATO for admitting Ukraine in the near future. Now, that situation, against this background, these changes since Yanukovych's election, Western policy makers may be tempted to write off Ukraine and turn their attention elsewhere. However, in my view, this would be a strategic mistake. The United States and the European Union have a strong stake in keeping open a European and transatlantic option for Ukraine. A reorientation of Ukraine's policy back towards Russia would shift the strategic balance in Europe and have a negative impact on the prospects for democratic change in Europe's eastern periphery, making it much more difficult for Georgia and Moldova to pursue their pro-Western course. It would also have a dampening impact on the long-term prospects for reform in Belarus and, quite frankly, for reform in Russia itself. While it's difficult to predict Ukraine's political trajectory at the moment, the United States and the EU, in my opinion, need to take the long view. Ukraine, like Turkey, is in the midst of an identity crisis, which will have a profound impact on the country's political evolution. This struggle is between Ukraine's eastern orientation, promoted by elites in the Russified eastern parts of Ukraine, and a Western orientation advocated by the pro-Western elites in central and western Ukraine. That's oversimplified, but the essence of it. The identity crisis, and I will winding up, is likely to take time to sort out, at least a decade, perhaps longer. U.S. and European policy, in my view, should be aimed at strengthening democratic institutions and promoting the growth of civil society, particularly the independent media, and business and student exchange. While the door to NATO membership should be kept open, in principle, the issue of NATO membership is likely to remain on the back burner for the immediate future. Focusing on NATO membership now will only inflame the political atmosphere and make progress on NATO itself and other important areas more difficult. The main obstacle is not Russian opposition, though this is an important factor, but the low public support for Ukrainian membership. As long as only about a quarter of the population favors NATO membership, the prospect for Ukraine being admitted to NATO will remain remote. With a more democratic and Western-oriented political leadership and power, support for Ukraine's integration into NATO could increase. But changing Ukrainian attitudes towards NATO will take time. However, until there is a stronger support for NATO among the Ukrainian population, the question of Ukrainian membership in NATO will remain largely theoretical rather than an important issue on the political agenda. While Ukrainian membership is not feasible in the time being, other steps in the security field could be taken to strengthen Ukraine's ties to the West. The United States and its European allies should, in my view, seek to engage the Ukrainian military in a dialogue on military reform and continue to involve Ukraine in peacekeeping operations both within NATO and on a bilateral basis. Nuclear safety is another area where the United States and Ukraine could usefully increase cooperation. Let me just add in the end that there is a danger of overemphasizing the importance of NATO. It is important, of course, but the real dangers and the real risks to Ukrainian security are not external, in my view. They are internal, and that is where the West, the United States, and the EU need to put their priority in the immediate future. Thank you.